everyone. Pull out your observation worksheets. Oh, wait a second, Alice, I have the mic. That's working though. So I did get that to work. Hello, hello. There we go. Okay. Perfect. Okay. All right. It's been a long day. Is that okay, Alice? Is that good?
Yes.
Okay. You are welcome. All right. Okay, so we are starting Joseph tonight. And yay, Joseph, right? So I think it's always interesting because as we look at Joseph, remember when I handed out most of your books to you, you looked at me and you said, Genesis part 5. I thought we were doing Joseph. And guess what? Joseph is Genesis part 5 at the end of Genesis. But I think it's important for us to realize kind of where Joseph fits into this narrative of Genesis and the whole purpose of this. And if you think of the Bible as a big story arc, right? And that's what people will talk about, that the Bible is a meta-narrative. It's a big story, right? And that story starts with God creating everything that we know. We see that the pinnacle of that creation is humanity, man and woman, Adam and Eve. And everything is going beautifully in this space where they're worshiping God, they're communing with God, they're with God on a daily basis. And then we get to chapter 3 and something horrible happens. And we see that in this beautiful space where God's communing with humanity, an intruder has come and has destroyed everything. Yes, a usurper. And he has destroyed everything that God had intended for humanity. Now, from that moment on, the meta-narrative becomes the redemption of this humanity. Because God loves this humanity so much, he cares for this humanity so much, that he is willing to go to whatever length has to be done to redeem them back to himself, to restore them back to the position that he had intended for them originally. So after we see them, Adam and Eve, leave the garden, we see that basically this rebellion against God continues, and it continues on through the murder of the brothers. It continues on then through the flood with Noah. And after the flood with Noah, what we see is that God starts this plan that he had promised Adam and Eve in the garden, that he would send someone who would redeem them, that this seed of Eve would destroy this enemy that had brought them all of this pain and sorrow. And what we see in chapter 12 of Genesis is that God starts this redemptive plan with a man named Abram. Now, Abram is one of the central characters in the Bible, right? To understand the Bible, you have to understand who Abram is. And you have to understand his relationship with God. And so what we see in chapter 12 is that Abram has left his home, which is basically in Mesopotamia. He is traveling with his family to Syria. He's in Syria. And his father dies, and God comes to him, and he tells Abram to follow him to a land that God will lead him to. And if Abram will do this, that God will give him the land, he will give him descendants, he will give him, that nations will come from him, he will be a blessing to people, and through him, all of the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, along the way, Abram has different choices that he makes to do what God asks him to do or not do, but what we see is that life for Abram is a life of faith, right? It's a life where he comes to trust God completely with every aspect of his life. Now, when these promises are made to him, though, there's one little problem regarding descendants and nations and all of those kind of things, that Abram's wife, who he dearly loves, she is what? Barren. She can't have any children, right? So this discussion of these descendants and the promise of these descendants becomes a really big narrative in Abram's life, right? So much so that at one point in time, Abram is going to leave everything that he has to one of his servants, one of his stewards, and God tells him, no, you're not going to leave everything that you have to a slave. What you're going to do is you're going to have a son from your own body, right? And this is in basically chapter 15 of Genesis, when Abram, we have that beautiful statement that Abram believed God, he trusted God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now the issue is that God tells Abram that this son will come from his body. So when this information is conveyed to Sarah, the obvious solution to the problem is that they will use a surrogate to produce a child, which is not uncommon in the culture at the time, right? And they will use Hagar, Sarah's maid, as the surrogate, with the understanding that any child that Hagar would produce would become Sarah's child, right? Now, this goes sideways pretty quickly after Hagar becomes pregnant, but out of this comes a son, and his name is Ishmael, right? And everything goes along pretty smoothly for about 13 years. And then God comes to Abram one day and he says, okay, now I'm going to give you a sign of the covenant that we have made. We're going to do all of this with the land, so you know for certain the land is yours and all of that. And he says, and I'm going to give you a child by Sarah. Now, this is a huge thing because up until this point, Sarah is pretty much seen as written out of the narrative. She doesn't seem to be really part of the plan. Ishmael seems to be that child from Hagar. But then Sarah is promised this child, and we see that this child, Isaac, becomes a central figure in the Old Testament of God's faithfulness and how God is able to do the impossible. Because when this information is given to Sarah and Abram, how old are they? They're old, right? Yeah. Sarah's close to 90, Abram's close to 100 years old. They are old, right? And this is why when we were looking at Hebrews, when the author of Hebrews talks about when Abram was asked to take Isaac and go sacrifice him on the mountain, what did Abraham know about Isaac? What did the author tell us in Hebrews?
He knew that he was going to be spared.
That he knew that even if he died, that God would resurrect him, right? Because Isaac was a child out of death. It would be no more difficult for God to resurrect him if he were killed on that mountain than it had been for God to originally create Isaac in Sarah's womb, right? But they have this beautiful little boy, and he becomes the one who will inherit all of Abraham's promises that God has given to him, right? Now, with that being said, what we need to remember, it's not like Ishmael is out in the cold. He's going to be a man who has nations of his own. He's going to have wealth of his own. He's going to have all of those things, but he's not going to inherit the promises, right? So then we see it's time for Isaac to get married, and Abraham sends his steward back to his family in Mesopotamia to find a wife for Isaac, and he finds a wife who is the daughter of Sarah's brother Laban, and he brings Rebekah home to Isaac. And Rebekah and Isaac have this, they fall in love with each other, they care for each other, but what problem does Rebekah have? She can't have any children, right? So what we see is that as the years go by, Isaac is praying for Rebekah to have children. After a certain period of time, she does have children, and she conceives, and she has these two twins that she is going to have. And these twins are constantly struggling in the womb, and Rebecca goes to God and asks him about this struggle, right? And what does God tell her? You have two nations living within you, right? And he makes the comment to her that the younger will serve the older. That the older will serve the younger. But he makes it very clear that these two boys will become nations. So, the boys are born, and how does the family dynamic look after these twins come up into the scene?
Two on one side and two on the other side.
Exactly. What we see is that Jacob is closer to his mother, Esau is closer to his father, and as time goes on, what we see is that there's this kind of struggle dynamic within the family. And it doesn't help matters any that at some point in time, and we talked about this in Hebrews, that Esau comes home one day after hunting, he's starving to death, and he wants the food that Jacob is making. And what does Jacob set as the price for the food?
His birthright.
His birthright. Right now, remember we talked about his birthright are all of those promises that he should inherit as the oldest son from his father Isaac. Now, but we also talked about that the author in Hebrews says that he doesn't really put much stock in those promises any longer because it hasn't been a long time since those promises had been made. It's been a very long time, right? So he sells that birthright, not really thinking much of it. But then the situation years later happens that it's time that Isaac is getting old, he's about to die, and it's time for him to bless his oldest son. Now, and we talked about this, that this blessing of the Father, it's hard for us to understand the gravity of it and the weight of it, but we know the importance of it because of the text when we look at it, because Rebecca is the one who decides that Jacob should get that blessing, right? Rebecca's the one who comes up with a plan. Rebecca's the one that talks Jacob into it. Now Jacob goes along with it, but what we see is it's very important to Rebecca that Jacob gets that blessing from Isaac. And does he end up getting the blessing from Isaac? He does. Now, is it deceitful? Yes, it is all of those things. But what we see is that Esau comes back from the task that his dad has sent him on before he will give him the blessing. And Esau comes in to receive the blessing, and what do he and Isaac realize? It's gone. It's that Jacob has come, Jacob has stolen the blessing from him, and that basically Isaac says that there's not really anything left for me to give.
Was it really stolen when Esau already sold it?
Well, the birthright was sold, but not the blessing. Because they're two distinct things. Right now, this is kind of where it's interesting now, because how does Esau feel about Jacob when this when this blessing is stolen?
Now he hates it.
Now and the text tells us, remember we looked at this, that he hated Jacob. So much so that he had already planned that when Isaac died, he was going to do what to Jacob? He was going to kill Jacob. Now, I think a lot of times when we see that in the text, that we just kind of go, yeah, how many times did I threaten to kill my brother or, to kill my sister? I never intended on doing it, but I said it. But I don't think we should approach the text that way. Because I think that when you look at this, these are not child statements. These are statements made by grown men about situations that's very important to their lives. And this is what I think sometimes with these stories in the Old Testament, if you've been raised in the church at all, or you've gone through any kind of Sunday school program or any kind of catechism or anything like that, we become really familiar with these stories. And the more familiar we are with them, the less we take them to be as serious as what they are. Now, does Rebecca take Esau's threat seriously, is the question. She does. And so much so that she arranges for Jacob to leave and go back to Mesopotamia to her family. Right now, what happens though on the way as Jacob has left, right, by himself, traveling back to his mother's family? What happens in Genesis 28 before he gets to Haran, right? Now Haran is where Abraham had originally heard from God. So Haran is in Syria, but Jacob is still in Canaan, and he stops that night and he goes to sleep. And what does he have a dream of? Do you remember? In chapter 28, you looked at this. The stairway, right? He has a dream of this ladder, this stairway that ascends from heaven, and in his dream, he sees angels going up and down the stairway, right? Up and down this ladder. And in the dream, he hears God at the top of the ladder. And basically, if we look at verse 13, God in this dream confirms to Jacob that he is the bearer of the blessing now, right? The promises that he had taken in a sense from Esau. So in verse 13 of chapter 28, it says, "And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Now, this is interesting because verse 15 is an addition to the promises that had been given to Abraham and Isaac. Right? Why do you think God tells him what he does in verse 15? Now see, I think it's really interesting of the concept of how God's worked back then. What people normally thought is that gods were regional gods, or they had dominion in certain parts of creation, but not in all creation. So like with the Canaanites, they believed that El Baal, the great storm god, he had control of the sky, of the storms, and all of that kind of thing, but he had no power on earth, right? So what is God assuring Jacob of with verse 15?
That he will be there regardless.
Yes, that wherever Jacob goes, who will be there? He will be there, right? And he also promises Jacob that at some point in time, he will do what? He will bring him back to this land, right? And he says, and I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised, right? Now, the promise of the descendants, the promise of the land, all of those kind of things are an everlasting promise. And it's not going to be fulfilled in Jacob's life entirely. So basically, God is saying to Jacob that he will never do what? He will never leave him, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that Jacob has this experience. He wakes up from the dream. He realizes that this is a very sacred space, that he's actually been in this place that God is in. And I want you to remember that at this point in time, and with this culture, and even with a lot of culture still today, they put a lot of stock in dreams, right? Now, like I said, I don't know exactly how this works, because we're not a culture that puts a lot of stock in dreams. Personally, I've had dreams that I hope never come true, right? we understand though is that they do put a lot of stock in these. And even if you talk to people now from the Middle East, they still do, right? So Jacob interprets this dream that he's actually had this visitation from God. God is going to go with him, God's going to bless him, and God will bring him back. Right now, what's interesting is that when you looked at chapter 32 of Genesis, Jacob does come back some years later, right? And the night before he meets Esau, because he doesn't know how Esau is going to receive him, he comes back to this same place. And what is interesting about that night is he has another encounter with God, right? And what's interesting about this encounter is he takes it upon himself to hamper this messenger who has been sent to him. And so we see this wrestling match ensue. And finally, to just kind of end the encounter, the angel strikes him on his hip and he's lame from that point on. But his name is changed, right? And from that point on, Jacob will also be known as Israel. So, the reason that this is important is because when you read the Old Testament, Israel can be Jacob, right? Or Israel can be the people who come from Jacob. And Jacob can be Jacob, or Jacob can be the people who come from Jacob, right? So you have to be really careful in how you look at the context of how the name Jacob is being used in the text. Now, the reason I bring that up is that sometimes people don't, and they come to a serious misunderstanding of Scripture, because Paul uses this understanding in Romans chapter 12, where he makes a statement and he's quoting, and it says, "And the Lord said, Jacob I have loved, and Esau I have hated." And what's interesting about that, it says that even in Rebekah's womb, there were two boys, and God said this. Right now, when you look back at the cross references, what you see is there are hundreds of years between those cross references. The first part of the cross reference is the Genesis issue with when Rebekah's pregnant with the twins, and God says that Jacob will be over Esau. The last part of that passage, though, is from Micah, hundreds of years later, after the Jews have come back from Babylon, and it's used in the context of Esau, the nation, or the Edomites, I have hated, because of what they did to their brothers Jacob when they came out from Egypt, right? So when you look at the context in the Micah passage, Paul is talking about that in Genesis 12, he's not talking about individuals there, he's talking about the nations that came out of them, but sometimes the nations are referred to by the father's name, right? So from this point on, in Genesis 32, what you see is that Israel and Jacob are the same person, right? And you just have to let the context tell you if you're talking about the individual or if you're talking about the nation or the people that come from the individual, okay?
What was Micah's?
I'd have to look it up exactly for you, but it's what Paul quotes in Romans chapter 12. Okay. Now, so does Jacob, after he has this encounter with God, does he go on to his mother's family back in Mesopotamia? Does he just keep going, or does he stay there and camp at this place and kind of make a shrine for a while and hope for another mystical experience, or does he get up the next morning and just head on his way? He just gets up the next morning and heads on his way. And he makes it back to his family. And what's really interesting, you see some similarities when Jacob comes back to his family, as when his grandfather had sent his his steward to find a wife for Isaac. He encounters this young woman at the well, right? He realizes that she's related to him, and this is the first time he meets Rachel. Now, Rachel takes him home, and he meets his uncle named Laban. And Laban is probably one of the worst scoundrels in the entire Old Testament, right? He's a dishonest person. He's just a scoundrel, right? But does he take Jacob in?
Yes.
Very much so, right? But what we see is that as time goes on, we see this love developing between Rachel and Jacob. And Jacob. Until it comes to a point where Jacob comes to Laban one day and says, I want to marry Rachel. And what does Laban say to him?
Yeah.
Sure, you can marry Rachel. But then he sets this extreme bride price for Rachel. And what is the bride price for Rachel? 7 years of working for Laban with minimum, if any, pay. Right? Now, what's beautiful about this is that how does Jacob feel about this though? Yeah, the text tells us, and what's really beautiful about this is that the text tells us that to Jacob, it was like just a few days that his love for her was so great, right? Now, that becomes an important part of their story, right? Is this intense love that Jacob has for Rachel. And so the 7 years come to an end. It's time for the wedding, and we have the wedding, and I think sometimes we look at this historical issue with the wedding, and we think, well, how much of a dupe is Jacob, right? But what you have to remember is that when it talks about these women being veiled, when a woman was veiled in that time, you could not see her, right? We're not talking about little thin veils where, we're talking about, think burqa, right? That basically what you're seeing is just their eyes, right? So the wedding comes. Now also remember, women don't say a lot, they don't engage a lot in this culture. So they come, they have the wedding, and everything's going well. They have the celebration for the wedding, which is a wedding celebration, and there's lots of wine and lots of celebrating and lots of those things. And Jacob goes to the tent to be with his beloved Rachel, right? And remember, this is a dark tent, aren't any lights, little wine's been drank, all of these kind of things. And Jacob wakes up the next morning, and much to his surprise, he rolls over, and who has he slept with that night? Leah. Now, this is interesting because pretty much we haven't heard anything about Leah until this moment, right? So who is Leah?
Older sister.
Rachel's older sister. Right, so like any good husband who wants a exchange, right? Takes his receipt to Laban and says, hey, I want to exchange, right? And what does Laban say to him? We can't do it. Yeah. Right.
Why didn't he tell him that in the first
Well, see, this is what I think is always so interesting about this. Nowhere in the text does Laban ever say anything that Leah has to be married before Rachel can, because I'm sure that Jacob would have been actively finding a husband for Leah if he had known that this was the case. And so none of this, and I mean, there are a lot of things that you can read into the story. Maybe Laban does it because he realizes how wealthy Abraham's family has become. Because remember when the steward came for Isaac's bride, remember it was camel loads of stuff that guy brought with him rings, bracelets, cuffs, nose rings, necklaces, fabric, food. I mean, it was a caravan of stuff that Abraham sent for whoever would marry Isaac would get all this stuff, right? So Laban knows that Abraham's family is wealthy, and he basically, but I think it's so interesting how callous Laban is about this, right? Because basically in Genesis 35, right? Is it 35? No, 29. In verse 27, he says, complete the week with this one, and we will give you the other, also for the service which you shall serve with me for another, what? 7 years, right? So now Jacob is enslaved to Laban another 7 years for Rachel, but he says, but just spend a week with Leah, and then you can have Rachel, you can live with her as man and wife. And what we see is just kind of the insensitivity of the whole situation here. How these two girls are just used as a commodity for Laban to get work out of Jacob. But what does Jacob say? Okay, because how does he feel about Rachel? He loves her deeply. Right now, what's interesting about this though is the question of why do they request that Leah be able to spend a week with Jacob?
To legalize
Bingo.
the marriage.
Well, the idea is that after Jacob realizes that he's been duped, he doesn't love Leah. He didn't want to be married to Leah. The chances are that once this week is over, he will never sleep with Leah again if he has Rachel. So this week is given to Leah in the hope that she will conceive a child, right? And the hope is that she may conceive, and this might be the only opportunity she ever has to conceive a child. And that's why they say, spend the week with this one during this whole celebration time, and then we'll give you Rachel. Right now, the years go on, and does Laban treat Jacob very well? No, he's horrible. He changes all kinds of agreements that they have. He does all kinds of things to Jacob. One day Jacob just wakes up and he realizes that they're barely making it, but yet who's becoming very wealthy because of Jacob? Laban is, right? And this is an important thing for us to see that will carry on into the Joseph narrative. Jacob is basically a slave in a foreign country. He's a slave to a family member, but he's still in servitude because of this contract that he has for Rachel. And when those years are over and he realizes that Laban isn't going to live up to his part of the deals that they make and all of that kind of thing, Jacob calls Rachel and Leah together and he says, we need to go back to my family, right? And these two sisters say, absolutely. It's probably the only time they ever agree on anything, right? And what you see is that they say, yes, we have no part in our father's inheritance. He's not doing anything to help our family. He's not helping us, in any way, shape, or form. So they're all on board of going back to Jacob's family. Now, what's interesting is that Laban gets wind of this because Jacob, the Lord shows him how to do this interesting thing with breeding stock, which it doesn't matter how many times I read these passages about these goats and these sheep, ew. There's no scientific way to explain this, but what we see is that Jacob, with God's help, Jacob devises this plan of how to increase his herds and things like that he's going to take with him back home. So one day Jacob picks up all of his wives, picks up all of his kids, and he heads home, right? But what's interesting in the meantime that they have been there, Jacob has created a huge family, right? And what you see is that Leah did conceive that week, and she gives Jacob his first son, Reuben. Now, the story, the sadness of the story, and the situation that these two women have been put in is seen by the names they name their children. Because Leah knows from the time that she marries Jacob, he does not love her, right? He had never asked for her to be his wife. He was in love with Rachel. And you see this in the names of her children because she believes that as she's producing children, that Jacob will somehow come to do what? Love her, right? But I think that we look at this, and it's really hard in our Western sensitivities to see this. But you need to remember that just because Jacob does not love Leah, she is not mistreated. All right? She is cared for, she's provided for, she's living in the family with all of them, and she's producing these children, which I'm sure makes Jacob very happy, but he doesn't love her, right? And the problem is that Rachel, what is the issue with Rachel?
She's not procreating.
She's barren, right? And this is what becomes a huge thing between these sisters, because theologians call these chapters in Genesis the War of the Wombs. And what you see is the woman that's deeply loved by her husband, she can't have children. The sister who's not loved by her husband, it seems like every time that they're together, she conceives a child, right? Until finally, Rachel gets so upset, and I always think that this, and you see Jacob in all of this, and I think this time was one of the first times that I really sat back and thought to myself, how does Jacob feel about all this? All right? And what you see here is that he's sympathetic to Rachel's plight, but Rachel comes to him, the text tells us one time, and she's just like, basically, she says, give me children or I'm gonna die, right? Now, acting like somehow Jacob has the control over that, right? But we see the desperation in Rachel when she makes that statement to Jacob, because it opens the door for them to consider another possibility, which is the understanding of using a surrogate. Because Rachel and Leah were both given maidservants by Laban when they got married. So what does Rachel tell Jacob to do? Go in and take my maid, right? And the language is very clear. If she conceives a child, it will be my child. Through her, I'm going to be able to produce sons. And so Rachel opens the door for Jacob to have these two concubines then as wives, right? Now, remember, concubines are considered wives.
But they're secondary.
They're secondary wives, but they're still considered wives, right? But Rachel and Leah are Jacob's wives, right? But the maids are wives in the lesser sense. Like if you want to do capital W and little w, they're wives in the lesser sense. But the children they produce are supposed to be, in a sense, the property of the sisters. So Jacob goes into Rachel's maidservant, and what happens?
Procreation.
She gets pregnant. So then what we see then is by this time, Leah isn't getting pregnant anymore. And once Rachel does this with the maidservant, what does Leah turn around and do? She's like, okay, well, if you're going to sleep with her, then you're going to sleep with mine. And we see all of these children being produced, right? Now, what's amazing about this is at the end of all of this, Joseph ends up with 12 sons in the end who will make it to adulthood, which is absolutely astonishing given the infant mortality rate of the time. And he will have daughters that will be given to him as well. So Jacob's family, and I think this is so interesting because if you look at what the dynamic of the family had been to that point in time, by the time that Abraham dies, he has 6 sons. He has Ishmael through Hagar, he has Isaac through Sarah, he has 4 sons, I think, with Keturah after Sarah dies, so he has 6 sons. Isaac only has the 2, right? He has Jacob and Esau. But then Jacob goes over here and he comes home with how many kids?
64.
He's got a good little of them, right? he's got all of these children. So at some point in time, he sets off with all of his kids and all of his property and all of his herds, and he comes back to the land that God has promised him, because under the covenant promises, whose land is this? It's his land, right? So he comes back. Now, the question is, how's Esau going to handle that? And what we see is that Esau's fine with it, tempers have cooled over all these years and all of these things, but Esau and Jacob, they reconcile, but they don't live next to each other, because Esau's become a huge family of his own.
He has at least 12 kids, 12 sons also.
Yeah, he has a whole bunch. And so what we see is that they decide to not live close to each other, right? And that's where chapter 37 starts, right? Is after this whole thing of Jacob coming home has happened. Now, what we also need to remember, though, is that on the way, Rachel will have died, giving birth to her last son, Benjamin. So she has Joseph in her old age, and she has Benjamin, right? And so when it talks about the mother here in the text, when Jacob will say something to Joseph about his mother, it is not Rachel, it's Leah. She has taken on the role of mother in the family, right? So it says, now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned in the land of Canaan, and these are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when he was 17 years of age, was pasturing a flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Okay, now, I think that's always interesting, because one of the things I think is now remember, every piece of information that we're given in historical narratives, we're given that information for a reason, right? When you read historical narratives, there's not a whole lot of throwaway information. Now, so what we see is that when we're introduced to Joseph, he's still a teenager. He's only 17 years old. And you have to remember, so he's like the second from the youngest, right? Benjamin is the baby of the family, but Joseph is next to being the baby of the family. And the situation happens, we're not told when it had happened, but as this teenager, he had been with his adult male brothers, right? These brothers, by this time, are full-grown men, probably having started families of their own, right? So we're not talking about some kind of teenage squabble between brothers. We're talking about the older brothers are now adults, they're doing these, but something has happened at one of these times when they have been away from the family. They were doing something that they should not be doing, and Joseph tells Jacob about it. Now, I always think it's interesting because so many times when we read this, people just assume, well, Jacob's just being a tattletale, right? But I think that what we see as the narrative goes on, there is an issue with these brothers when they are gone. Because possibly what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas issue, because what we see is that there will be another time that Jacob will send Joseph to check on these brothers, right? So I wouldn't assume that Joseph is just, in a sense, being a tattletale because he wants to be on Jacob's good side. It could very possibly be that these brothers are doing something that is serious enough that Jacob, as the patriarch of the family, needs to know about, right? And Joseph tells him about that. But then we're also told in verse 3 an interesting dynamic in the family as well. In verse 3, what are we told? That Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a vari-colored tunic, right? Now, I think this is interesting because why does Jacob love Joseph more than his other brothers?
Rachel is the mother.
He's Rachel's son, right? And I think this is an interesting dynamic, and I just want to put this out here for you. You can disagree if you choose to, but I think what you see is that Joseph is a man who the people that he loved deeply, right? He loved Rachel enough to work for her for 7 years. Jacob loved Rachel enough to work for her for 7 years, almost in slavery. And then he loves her enough to work another 7 years. So in all, he paid an extreme bride price for Rachel, right? He loves her deeply. Now, when I say that, remember, I'm not saying that he abused Leah or the other maids or anyone like that. What we see is that he still provides for them. He still does his husbandly duty to provide children for these women. He does all of these things, but the people that he loves deeply. And Joseph is Rachel's son and the son of his old age, right? And so we see this affection that Joseph has, or that Jacob has for Joseph. Now, I think that it's important because nowhere in the text are we told that Joseph doesn't love his other sons. That Jacob doesn't love his other sons. We're told that he just loves Joseph more. Okay? So I think that that's an important thing because so many times Jacob is painted as this horrible father who doesn't care anything about his other sons, anything like that. That's not what the text says. It doesn't say that he didn't care for his sons. It doesn't say that he didn't care for Leah or the other women. It's just that he had this love for Rachel and her sons.
And we know later on that Jacob loved his other sons because they're concerned about how he'll feel when they have to take the news back.
Right. Okay. And so we see that there. Now, is this going to be problematic? Absolutely, it's going to be problematic. Right? But what I want you to see, this is one of the beauties of the Bible. You know what? The Bible can face historical narrative, warts and all. Right? And this is what we see happening in family dynamics all the time. If you were to talk to somebody who's trying to blend a family, they would tell you that blending children in a family is one of the most difficult things that you can do because of the dynamic of it. And this is exactly what's happening in this family. But he gives Joseph this symbol of his love for him, which is this amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? And so what we see though is what's interesting is how the brothers react to this gift in verse 4. And in verse 4 it says that his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they did what? They hated him, and they couldn't even do what with him? They couldn't even speak to him on friendly terms, right? Now, remember, I think this is interesting because had Jacob experienced this relationship with his own brother?
Yeah.
He had. But what we see here is that these brothers, they hate Joseph, right? So much so they cannot even say one kind word to him. They can't even, it appears basically, even be in the same room with him because of their hatred for him. So it goes on and it says, now, it's interesting because Joseph doesn't really help the situation in the next verses.
Yes.
As
Right.
wise as Joseph is supposed to be, this dude's an idiot.
Okay, well,
He's a
but
teenager.
he's 17, right? He's 17 years old, all right? And I mean, I think that 17-year-olds do a lot of things that, you know, they just do, all right? And now remember the importance of dreams in this culture, right? So it says that Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they did what?
They were not happy.
They hated him even more, right? Now, the question is, what is the dream that brings about even a more intense feeling of hatred on the parts of his brother? What is it about the dream that brings them to this place?
The
Right.
sheep bow down.
Yes, and the dream is prophetic, right? The dream is prophetic because he says he sees them all out in the field gathering wheat, right? He says, please listen to this dream which I have had, for behold, we were binding sheaves in the field. So those wheat sheaves. And lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect. Behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Now, what will his brothers end up coming to Egypt for?
Great.
Wheat.
Wheat,
My wheat's better than yours.
right? And so what we see here is that this dream is prophetic. It's prophetic about how they will get the wheat, but it's also prophetic about why they will come into contact with Joseph again, right? So what we see now, how do the brothers respond to this?
Not well. Negatively.
Negatively, because what do they say that they understand the dream to mean in verse 8?
They're supposed to be bowing down to him.
Yeah, he says, are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? I now remember, in the pecking order of this family, where does Joseph fall?
Next to last.
Next to the last. So they're saying, the 10 of them are saying, so you think that somehow you're going to come to be the patriarch of our family? That somehow that all of us are gonna be skipped and you're gonna be the one that has power over this family? Okay, now, given the culture, that's a pretty serious thing, right? So we have dream number 1, just about Joseph and his brothers.
So even with those, yeah, so I guess would Jacob have known or about the thing that God told Isaac? Or not Isaac, his mom? Like Isaac's
We don't-
wife?
We don't know, because we're never told in the text that Rebecca actually shared that prophecy about the 2 of them. But, and what's really interesting about it is that it's not fulfilled in Jacob and Esau's actual lives. Esau doesn't serve Jacob when he comes back. They separate, they have their own families, they have all of that kind of thing. So the prophecy about the older serving the younger is really about the nations that will come out of them, not the brothers themselves. So see, this is what I think is interesting. Here you have, it's interesting when you follow things that God brings in this family. Barren women, okay, you know, twins,
Psychotic
with
brothers.
it, just, you know, but what we see here is that this is a picture of this family that God has chosen to bless, right? But it's interesting because the first dream doesn't have anything to do with Jacob or Leah, right? But then Joseph has another dream. And it says, now he had another dream, and he related it to his brothers, and he said, Lo, I had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Now this time he tells who about this dream? He tells Jacob about the dream and his brothers. And what does Jacob do?
You insolent pup.
Yeah, he rebukes him, right? So this does away with the notion that a lot of times people have that Jacob just let Joseph do whatever he wanted to. That he was just a spoiled brat. That he got to do whatever. That there were no restraints on Joseph or anything, because when Joseph brings this dream to Jacob, Jacob says, wait a second, right? And he says to him, what is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground?
Yep, there you go.
Okay, now remember, we understand the end of the story, but this is being interpreted by them in a family context, right? So basically, what they're thinking the dreams mean is that Joseph will become what over the family? He will become the patriarch over the family, right? We understand the dreams to be prophetic about years and years into the future with Egypt. But when they hear the dreams, they're hearing it that Joseph will become the ruler and the patriarch of the family. Dog.
Who's the oldest brother?
Reuben.
Reuben is the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
Where does Judah lie?
Judah is number 4.
Okay. And then which line does Jesus come from?
Judah.
Judah. I found that interesting because of what Judah does.
Yes. Okay. So what we see here is that these dreams, nobody is like, oh, we're so glad that Joseph has had these dreams, right? Because Joseph's dreams were about Joseph holding a place of power and authority over people who were older than he was, and such should hold the place of power and authority, not Joseph, right? And what we see is that these dreams, in verse 11, these dreams compel the brothers to another level, that they are what? Well, it says that they're jealous of him, right? So if you look at this narrative, you see hatred building upon hatred, jealousy building upon jealousy, until in verse 14, what he says is that in verse 13 it says, Israel said, or in verse 12 it says, then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come and I will send you to them. And he said to him, I will go. Now, the question is, why does Jacob send Joseph? And it doesn't seem like a wise idea, right? Given the tensions within the family. But Jacob says, go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now, why is it that Jacob sends Joseph? To check on his property and to check on his sons that are supposed to be taking care of his property. And he sends Joseph with the instruction that he's supposed to check on the welfare of both and come back and tell him what he finds. Now, it's interesting given what we're told at the very beginning, and Joseph was 17 years old, and then we're told about this incident where he had been with his brothers before and had brought back a bad report. Now, it would appear that Jacob is not entirely comfortable just sending the boys off anymore without someone bringing back him some information about what they're actually doing, right? So,
Yeah, but the
Joseph,
question does have to be asked.
well,
Because he probably has some slaves or some trusted helpers that he could have sent to go looking after his boys.
right, but these are grown men, right? And this is why I think this is something that there is something here that whatever the incident was that we were told about in the beginning of the story was not necessarily just a minor situation. That Jacob or Joseph had told him about something that Jacob needed to know about. Now they go back out, they take the flocks back out. We're told very clearly where Jacob is and the family. They're in the valley of Hebron. The boys are supposed to be where? In Shechem. And Joseph comes to Shechem, and who's not there? The brothers are not there, and the herds are not there. And it says that a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock." And then the man said, "They have moved from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" Now, Dothan is a long ways away from Shechem. Now, and what's interesting is the brothers don't send word back to Jacob that they're not going to be where they're supposed to be. If Joseph had come in contact with this man who overheard the conversation, then Joseph wouldn't know where they were at all. Right? So we have this interesting situation that's kind of developed here as we pay attention to what's that, because it's not like the boys told the guy, if you see a brother, if you see someone from our father's household, tell them we have moved to Dothan. No, they've just moved to Dothan, right? So Joseph doing what Jacob has told him to do, he goes where? He goes to Dothan, right? And in verse 18, now we see this situation unfold. It says, when they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to do what? To put him to death. Now, this I think is this is hatred at its inevitable outcome, right? And why is it that they decide that it's time for Joseph to die? Here comes that dreamer. It's the dreams that push them over. It's not the tunic, it's the dreams and what the dreams represent, right? That's why they decide to kill Joseph, because if they kill Joseph, he'll never what? He'll never be over them, right? He'll never rule over them. So they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. Right? So it's the dreams that have pushed them over. Now, Reuben, as the oldest, right, he says, wait a second, we need to be careful about this. And he's heard that this, and he rescued him from their hands. And he said, let us not take his life, because murder is a serious thing. Right? And especially murdering your brother. And he says, and Reuben further said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him. Now, what is Reuben's plan? Right? So we've got numerous plans going on here. The consensus is that Joseph needs to what? Die.
Disappear.
Something needs to happen with Joseph. But Reuben says, he's like, okay, let's just throw him in the pit. And then what does Reuben intend on doing? Rescuing him. But it's interesting, not because of any affection for Joseph. He was going to rescue him and restore him to who? His father. Right? In this account that we see here, there is no affection, no consideration for Joseph as their brother, anything like that. Reuben realizes that as the oldest, he will be the one to answer for what happens to Joseph, who is his younger brother. Right? And he doesn't want to answer to Jacob about Joseph. So his plan is that he'll give them some time to cool off. He'll rescue Joseph. He'll take him back to Jacob and probably tell Dad, don't send Joseph to check on us anymore. Okay? So yeah, Dom.
Well, just like you were talking about Jacob having no love for Rachel, I think that Reuben could have no love for Joseph, but still love his father.
And that's exactly what we see.
I mean,
Yeah.
You're saying that these guys are all, most of these guys are all grown men. At that point, it's very possible that Reuben's a dad,
Yes, it's very possible.
right? So he would recognize what a child means to their father, right?
Right, and what we have to realize is that Reuben is the oldest. He carries the responsibility of the firstborn. And I think this is what is really interesting about here. He doesn't rescue Joseph. His plan isn't to rescue Joseph for Joseph's sake. His plan is to rescue Joseph for Jacob's sake.
Right,
Yeah, and that's what I think where you do see that Reuben does have this, either he has affection for his father, or at least he has an understanding of responsibility because of who he is in the family, right? So what we see is that this is what Reuben's plan is, as the oldest. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers, that they stripped him of his tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and they threw him into a pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. Now, once again, why did they take the tunic? Why don't they just throw Joseph in the pit with the tunic?
They wanna use evidence.
It's going to be used later on to show that Joseph has been killed, right? And it's really interesting because the pit that they throw him in, there are kind of two ways of looking at this pit. It says that there wasn't any water in the pit, so basically what we know is that Joseph's not going to be able to have anything to drink while he's in the pit, right? So that's a bad thing. But if the pit had had water in it, it could have been very detrimental to Joseph's health, right? It could have been a wadi where there was a spring or something like that. But what we see here is that these brothers have thrown their 17-year-old brother into a place where he is incapable of getting out on his own. Now, what's interesting about it is after they commit this act of violence, what do they go and do? They go and eat, right? The next verse says, then they sat down to eat a meal. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah decides, oh, we could change the plan here, right?
Reuben must not have been around.
Reuben isn't around because he comes back later, but Judah, what is his plan that they could actually do? We could make some money off of Joseph. So who in the end actually saves Joseph? Judah does, right? Out of his greed, he actually ends up saving Joseph. And so he said, what profit is there for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. So with Judah's plan, they aren't going to be guilty of murder. They'll still be rid of Joseph and make money off of Joseph's misery. Joseph's death or slavery will make sure that the dreams never do what? Come true. Right now. This is just kind of a side note too, but did you notice who actually purchased Joseph? Ishmaelites and Midianites. He's purchased by his cousins. All of these people in the narrative are from Abraham. Okay, so it's like, this is an interesting thing here that Moses is telling us. So they take Joseph now. I think it's so interesting because it says some of the Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. That is one of the shortest sentences, but it's such a short sentence to convey the betrayal and the brutality that has just happened to Joseph. Because have you ever just sat and thought about this event? Have you ever thought about the pleading on Joseph's part. The crying to his brothers not to do this to him. The insensitivity and the callousness of his brothers as they watch him being bound and collared and taken to Egypt, right? Because it's not like they just put Joseph on a camel and took him to Egypt. He was collared with other slaves and he walked to Egypt, right? This is probably one of the most brutal things that we see in the Bible, but yet it's conveyed in this short sentence, and thus Joseph was taken to Egypt. But the heartlessness of it is amazing, right? But then after Joseph's gone, who returns? Reuben does. And he looks in the pit and Joseph is gone. And what does he automatically realize? He's gone. There's no way now that Joseph can be restored to Jacob. There's no way to take back his beloved son to him. And the impact of that is overwhelming to Reuben, because it says he tears his clothes. What you see is this, he's overcome by sorrow, by all of remorse, by all of this. And he actually says to his brothers, the boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go? Because he's like, how am I going to answer our father as to what has happened to Joseph? Where am I going to go now? It's my responsibility. It's going to be seen as my responsibility. And Jacob is going to take it that I have not fulfilled that responsibility. And so what do the brothers end up deciding to do?
Put blood on his tunic and bring it back.
Yeah.
Just kill him.
Okay? They're gonna implement part of the original plan, right? Because the original plan is that they would kill Joseph and throw him in a pit. They would take the tunic, they would soak it with blood, and that would be proof to Jacob that Joseph had been eaten by a wild animal. Well, now they still have to do that part of the plan, right? Because they have to explain why Joseph isn't there anymore. And I think what's really interesting is that so they took Joseph's tunic, they slaughtered a male goat, and they dipped the tunic in blood, and they sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, we found this, please examine it, whether it is your son's tunic or not. What's interesting about this is the way that it reads is that they don't even bring the tunic back to Jacob, they send it to him.
That's what I was wondering about, because it looked like two different things.
Yeah, they send it to him. It appears with a messenger or with some kind of note or something like this. Is this Joseph's? See, this is what I think is so horrific about what happens to Joseph. And so Jacob, how does he respond? He is undone by the death of Joseph. He is brought to his knees by the death of Joseph. And it says, so Jacob tore his clothes, he put sackcloth on his loins, and he mourned for his son many days. Now, I think what's even more insensitive is what the brothers do now. It says that all his sons and all his daughters arose to do what?
Comfort him.
To comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Now, let me ask you something. Put yourself in the brothers' situation. You're sitting there. Judah, Naphtali, Dan. How do you comfort your father who is grieving to this extent, knowing that you are the cause of his grief? And it's a lie. It doesn't say anywhere in the text that the brothers mourn Joseph. It says that they come after a number of days to comfort their father, but it doesn't say that any of them mourn Joseph, because all along, what have we been told? What did they feel about Joseph? They hated him. The thought of those dreams coming true was more than they could stand. And you know what? And so they come, but the insincerity of this, and is Joseph or is Jacob even comforted? No, he's not. He's not comforted in any way, because basically he tells them, surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. basically, what is Jacob telling his children?
I'm gonna die from this.
Yeah, I'm gonna die from this, or I will spend the entire rest of my life mourning for Joseph. And it says, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. Right? So now we know where Joseph makes it to Egypt. But I think it's so interesting because this lie that the brothers tell doesn't change the entire fabric of their family. How is Jacob from this moment on?
Never complain.
He's never comforted by the death of this. And what even happens is that Benjamin then, because of this event, Jacob becomes hyper protective of Benjamin, the little brother. So Benjamin is basically like encaged because of what had happened to Joseph. So what you see is that this hatred leads to this horrible event that the family will live in for the next few decades, right? But it's interesting because Judah experiences something then in the next chapter that I think is interesting because it basically says that Judah, this is how we know that they're adult men in this. After this happens with Joseph, Judah takes off and he goes to visit a friend, right? And while he's there visiting a friend, he meets his Canaanite woman. He falls in love with her or lust, whatever, decides that he wants her to be his wife, and she gives him 3 sons, right? Now, time goes on, and the text tells us it's time for Judah to find a wife for his oldest son here, and he finds this woman named Tamar. And what are we told about Judah's oldest son? He is a wicked man, right? He is so wicked and so evil in the sight of the Lord that the Lord just does what? He takes his life, right? Now, when this happens with his oldest son and there isn't any heir produced, what we see is that Judah then marries Tamar to Onan. Now, this is not unusual, right? What we even have is that this is a practice that God will tell Israel to continue in Deuteronomy 25, and it's known as levirate marriage, right? And the purpose for levirate marriage was to keep inheritance lines intact. So, and the story of Ruth and Boaz is the story of levirate marriage being acted out in real time to keep Naomi's inheritance rights intact for her family, right? So how this worked is if an older son died without a son, then it was the responsibility of one of the unmarried relatives to take that widow and have a child with her. If they had a son, the oldest son that they have is not theirs in the sense that he will be in their inheritance line. He will, in a sense, be given to the parent or the grandmother or someone like that, in a sense that he will inherit the brother who died. He will be his heir. Right now, the problem with this is that a lot of times people don't want to do it, and this is what we find out with Onan and what we find in the situation with Ruth and Boaz, is that if you agree to this, you may be putting your own inheritance line in danger because you are not guaranteed that you will have a second son, right? So if you have one son and it goes to your brother's inheritance line, and then you end up having a bunch of girls after that son, then you're kind of in the same situation that the brother was, in that you don't have any males to inherit. And that's why we don't see a lot of times of people actually doing the levirate custom, right? But Judah does. And he gives Tamar to Onan, but what does Onan decide that he doesn't want to do? He doesn't want to produce an heir for his brother. If he produces an heir, he wants it to be his heir. So what we see is that Onan dies as well, right? So, but Judah has 3 sons. And what does he tell Tamar?
Wait till the very last old enough.
Yeah, wait for the last son to grow up, and when he's old enough for you to marry, I will give him to you. But until that time, what we see is that Tamar is living as a widow in mourning
In her father's house.
in her father's house, right? So she's basically sent back for years to her father's house, basically saying, wait in this limbo of mourning. Jacob doesn't release her to marry somebody else, right? Which is a really cruel act, in a sense. He says, just wait for my youngest son. But then, when his youngest son comes to the age of being married, what does Judah not do?
I don't wanna risk him.
He won't give Tamar to him. Because in Judah's mind, there's something wrong with this woman. I've married her to 2 sons, and both of those sons have done what? They've died.
He didn't ask God why.
Now, I think what's interesting is that Judah is now experiencing, in a sense, what Jacob felt in protecting his youngest son. Now he knows what it means to lose sons, and he has 1 son left, and what is he not gonna do? He's not gonna lose that son. So he's not gonna give him to Tamar, as is the custom. But he's not gonna release Tamar from the family either, right? He's totally ignoring her over here. But then, so the years go on, and then Mrs. Judah dies, right? And Tamar gets word that Judah's gonna be doing what? Well, he's gonna come to the sheep shearing, right? There's gonna be time for all of them to get together to shear their flocks, and Judah's gonna come. And as Judah's walking to the place where they're gonna shear the flocks, remember, Mrs. Judah's dead now. He sees, now Tamar comes up with a plan. And what is Tamar's plan? She disguises herself, right? She veils herself, right? And she's sitting by the side of the road. And what's interesting about it is that Judah doesn't, the only conversation that Judah has with this woman on the side of the road is, can I come in and be with you, and how much will you charge me? Right? And what does this, I mean, it's such an intriguing situation if you let your mind play it out, right? Tamar is sitting there, and she says to Judah that the cost will be what?
His staff and his.
Identification.
No, the first thing is a baby goat, okay? Now, I think that that's a pretty high price, right? But what does Judah say? Okay, now Tamar, wasn't born yesterday, and what does she say to Judah? Yeah, how do I know you're gonna be honest and send me my baby goat? What are you gonna give me as a pledge? And this is what I think is so amazing about Judah. What does Judah hand her? His whole identity. It is like everything that he has. It's like his passport, his driver's license, his platinum visa, everything that identifies Judah, he hands over to this woman who's a prostitute, he assumes. I don't know what that says, but it says something, right? And the deal is that when he sends the baby goat, she'll give him back his identification, right? So they do what Judah wants to do, and he goes on his way, and then lo and behold, what happens with Tamar? She gets up and she goes home, right? Puts on her widow's clothes and just carries on life. But Judah is a man of his word, and so he tells his friend there in the area to take one of the baby goats and give it to the temple prostitute, which I think this is interesting too, that if it's a temple prostitute, why Judah was there. But what does his friend tell him? Nobody's been here. We haven't had a temple prostitute here in a long time. We don't know. And so Judah basically does what?
Okay,
Okay,
it might go.
you know what? And I think it's so interesting, he doesn't seem to be concerned about all of his identity stuff at all, right? Until 3 months later, word comes from Tamar's family that Tamar's what? Pregnant, okay?
Co-creators.
Now, I think this is interesting because she's not under her family's authority, she's under Judah's authority. And so they send Judah word about this. And what does Judah say should happen to her? No, she should be burnt. She should be burnt. Right? So they're dragging her out of the house to enact what Judah has said should happen to her. And she says, take these things to my father-in-law. They will identify who is the man who is the father of the child. And they take the stuff to Judah, and what does he realize?
My stuff,
This is all my stuff,
my lady,
right? This is my seal, my cord, my staff,
my problem.
everything. This is me, I'm the guy, right? Now, what's interesting about this is what he says about Tamar. What does he say about Tamar?
She was more righteous than Jesus.
She was more righteous than Judah. Now, what's interesting about this, now, remember, righteousness just means in good standing. Now, why is Tamar more righteous than Judah?
She was sticking to the covenant.
Okay, let me ask you, does Judah have any concern for the continuing of his family line?
Oh, for his youngest son only, yeah.
Well, no, not even that. I mean, because he's not gonna, by law, he can only give her to Tamar. He's already made that decision, and he won't do what?
Won't do that.
He won't give him to Tamar. So Judah has no concern for his family line continuing at all. But what does Tamar have concern over?
That, and she never nominated.
She's concerned over Judah's family line continuing. So much so that she takes this extreme action to hopefully conceive a child that will continue Judah's family line. Now, what is so interesting about this is that the family line is continued, right? And Judah, basically, he just kind of wants this to kind of push it under the rug. He does it because he's like, people are going to, laugh at us when they find out that this happened, all this kind of thing. But Tamar's pregnant with twins, right? Now this is interesting. Judah, Jacob has these twins. He's a twin. Now Judah has these twins. And what's interesting about this is that Tamar's act restores sons to Judah, not grandsons.
I was wondering about that, would they be his sons?
Yeah.
They are his sons.
But are they related to the,
They are Judah's sons,
Biological son.
biological sons.
and would they take
Right.
over the legacy of the two that died?
Well, see, this is the kind of interesting thing. I don't think they're produced under the Levirate marriage, but what you see here is that the two sons that were gone are restored to Judah,
Right.
right? So what we see is that he has a family line now to continue on, and we're not told what happens if he ends up giving Tamar to his youngest son. We're not told that because what we need to know is that Judah's family line, something of which he had not been concerned about at all, is now established because there are two biological sons of Judah now, right? So what we see though is this idea, but the reason that Judah doesn't do what he's supposed to do is because of his affection for his youngest son, which is interesting concerning what he was willing to do to one of his father's youngest sons, right? But now Judah sees this. Then we find in the next chapter, we find Joseph where?
So
In Egypt.
Is this, like, chapter 38 just seems kind of like a segue, so is that just kind of, placeholder to say how long Joseph was in Egypt?
I think it's because I think there are a couple of lessons to see here. First of all, is the importance of inheritance lines, right? That inheritance was going to be paramount because this nation, these boys will become the nation of Israel, right? So it's going to be important that there's a line coming from Judah. But what's beautiful about this, so as time goes on, Judah, even though it doesn't seem like he's all that moral of a person, right? The Messiah will come from the line of Judah. And what's beautiful is that remember in Matthew when we studied the genealogy of Jesus, there are the women who are in the genealogy. There is Rahab, there is Tamar, there is Rahab, and there is Ruth. And two of those women took it upon themselves to enact the Levirate custom to bring about the inheritance line, right? So we have that, but I think the part of it is too, is that we see Judah struggling with his own willingness to give up a son when he knows that something could happen to that youngest son. Just as what we saw in Jacob's distress at losing Joseph, right? But then we get to chapter 39, and where is Joseph? He's in Egypt. And have you ever sat and thought about what it was like for Joseph to come to Egypt? Because at this point in time, Egypt is rising in power as a world empire. It's totally different culture. All of Joseph's life, he's been what?
A shepherd.
A shepherd living in a tent with his family, moving from place to place. He's never lived in a permanent structure of any kind. He's probably never even seen a permanent building. All right? And he's brought to Egypt in this immense amount of humanity, different gods, different culture, all of these things of this young boy. And he's sold to someone who's important because Potiphar is what? In all of this Egyptness, who is Potiphar? He is the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, right? So it's not like he's just some Egyptian schluck, all right? This is a huge man of power that is he's brought into Potiphar's household. And what's interesting is we start seeing something about Joseph that had been said to Jacob when he left. What had God promised Jacob when he left to go find, when he went to his family in Mesopotamia? That night at the ladder, what did God tell him? Wherever you go, I will be with you, right? What do we see in verse 2 about God and Joseph? The Lord was with Joseph. And so he became a successful man. Now the question is, how did he become a successful man?
Because God had him granted in favor.
Okay, now, because it says, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to do what? Prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer over all his house. All that he owned, he put in his charge. Now, Joseph does not become successful in a sense, enjoying his own success. He becomes successful, but who's enjoying his success? Potiphar is. Just as Laban had enjoyed Jacob's success. Right? Both of them foreign lands. God is blessing them, but they're not the actual recipients and beneficiaries of the blessing. The people that they're working for are. But what is interesting, what does Potiphar come to understand about Joseph? He's blessed by whatever God he serves. He's blessed by that Lord, and he's blessed in a means of prospering Potiphar. Right? So as time goes on, does Potiphar just kind of promote Joseph and promote him, until finally we're told that after a number of years, and we're not told how many years passed between verse 1 and verse 6 of this chapter, but we know that it has to be a number of years, right? It's not like you're gonna turn everything that you own over to an 18-year-old, right? And what we see is that Potiphar is realizing things, time is going on to see that Joseph, anything he puts his hand to, it's blessed. And so at some point in time, where does Joseph find himself? What is his position in Potiphar's household? He is in charge of everything of Potiphar's. If Potiphar owns it, Joseph is in charge of it, right? So much so that pretty much what's the only thing that Potiphar has to worry about? What he's gonna eat that night, right? Joseph is taking care of everything else, right? And then we have another interesting sentence in verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, right? So much so that who starts taking notice? Mrs. Potiphar. Now, Mrs. Potiphar is not the most subtle of women, right? Because what does Mrs. Potiphar just one day, what does she just tell Joseph? Yeah, you know what? I want to sleep with you. Now remember, I think it's interesting, why would she even make that request? How does she see Joseph? He's handsome in form and appearance, but he's also a slave. He's a slave. Even though he still has all this power, he's still a slave, right? So she doesn't feel like she has any problem requesting this of him, but how does Joseph respond? He refuses. Now, what's interesting about this is how you see the moral character of Joseph developing in a foreign country, away from his family, but you see this moral character has developed. And he says, but he refused, and he said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except who? Except you, because you are his what? His wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? Now the question is that Joseph separates the things right there. What would be the great evil?
Sleeping with her.
Okay, why?
Because she's not his wife, she's somebody else's wife.
Okay, she's somebody else's wife. And what's interesting about this is that it's interesting how you see this play out, because basically what Joseph says to her is that he does see adultery as a sin, right? Which I think is interesting because this is before the Mosaic Law. So what we do understand is that adultery is not looked on kindly even before the Mosaic Law, right? But I think it's interesting because of what we've been told about how Potiphar has put all of his trust in Joseph. He has given Joseph complete authority over all that he owns. So what we see is the great evil would be the betrayal of Potiphar's trust and the authority Potiphar had given to him in that trust. The greatest betrayal would be to take someone he was not given. Joseph had authority to do whatever he thought best regarding all that was Potiphar's, including other slaves, but he clearly understood where that authority ended, and that authority ended in his regard to who? The wife, right? She is off limits. And so we see to take Potiphar's wife was a sin against Potiphar and ultimately a sin against God. Now, and it would be a sin against God because what has Potiphar acknowledged in regard to Joseph from almost the first time that he came into his house? His God, Joseph's God is with him. Right? So for Joseph to sleep with Potiphar's wife would also bring dishonor on God. It would not only be the greatest betrayal that he could enact against Potiphar in regard to where Potiphar has placed him, but it would also be this great disregard for the name of God in doing it. Right? And that's what he tells her. Now, does she take no for an answer? No. But see, I think this is so interesting because Joseph cares for Potiphar. Potiphar has been good to him. And so this is just like there are serious ethical lines that Joseph realizes here that cannot be crossed. But she doesn't see it that way because to her, he's just a slave. And she keeps on and on and on, which tells us something about Joseph perseveres even though he encounters constant pressure from her to do this. Until one day, Joseph finds himself in an impossible situation. And what is that impossible situation?
Trapped with her.
He's trapped in a sense by her in the house. There are no other household servants there, nothing like that. And she grabs him, she tries, to pull him into the room and do all of this kind of thing. And Joseph leaves, but in leaving, he leaves what? Yeah, he leaves his garment in her hand as he fled outside. Now, what does she do then?
Turns on it.
She calls the men of her household, right? And said to them, see he. Now this is interesting. He. Who's the he here? Potiphar. He says, see, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came to me to lie with me, and I screamed. Now the word here to make sport means to mock us, right? So what is she saying? That Potiphar brought this Hebrew slave in, and what has this Hebrew slave decided he can do? Yeah, as a slave, a Hebrew slave, he thinks he's our equal. And he thinks he is also equal to your master. Now see, this is interesting because she's kind of layering this blame on Potiphar in two ways. It's not just that it would be different if it were an Egyptian slave, because at least Egyptians are equal to one another in a sense that they're Egyptian. But Joseph is what? He's a Hebrew slave. And not only is he a Hebrew slave, but he thinks that he has the right now to everything that Potiphar owes. And who brought this on himself? Potiphar. Right? So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to Potiphar with these words. The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to me to make sport of me, and I raised my voice and I screamed, and he left his garment beside me and he fled outside. So basically, what does she say to Potiphar? Yeah, it's your fault. And he came in and he thinks that he has access to me in the same way you gave him access to everything else you have. And you have now shamed me. Right now, it's interesting because what you see is that they were fine using Joseph all of this time, but in this incident, he's reverted back to what?
A slave.
A Hebrew slave.
Yeah.
Even though they make all this wealth, they've used Joseph all these years, he's now back to this designation as a Hebrew slave. And Potiphar is in this place where he only has one option. Well, he has two options. He can either imprison Joseph or he can kill Joseph. And what does he choose to do? He imprisons Joseph, but it's interesting where he imprisons Joseph. He imprisons Joseph, and he took him and put him in jail, the place where the king's prisoners are confined. Now remember, Potiphar is what? The captain of the Pharaoh's bodyguards. So where do you think that Potiphar visits quite often? This jail, right? Yeah. But what's interesting is what happens to Potiphar's household now. Remember why? Yeah, why had Potiphar's household been prospering?
Joseph.
Because the Lord was with Joseph. Joseph's not in Potiphar's household any longer. Now he's in jail, And where does the text say that now is prospering because of Joseph being there?
Jail.
In the jail.
The jailer is, because what does he do with Joseph?
Puts him in charge.
He puts him in charge of everything, right? But what I want you to see is that there are 5 times, I think, that I looked when I marked this passage, from verse 1, that the Lord was with Joseph. 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 Now, what does this tell us then that Joseph is now learning in the midst of all of this? I mean, he has this initial trauma. Everything seems to be going okay. Then we have this trauma. But what is it that we see that Joseph is going to be learning?
Trust
The Lord is with Joseph.
The Lord is with him. Now,
Have his word.
yeah, now remember, this is what his father had been promised. And I think that this is what's so beautiful about this, because up until this passage, we're not told that Joseph and God particularly have any kind of intimate relationship. Did you guys see it anywhere? No. But what do we see developing in Egypt? This understanding that God is with Joseph. And he's not just with him, but he's prospering him. So, what do we learn about, what do we take away from this? Jake, you can stop it if you want to. What do we take away from this? What do you take for your own life from this event in Joseph's life?
No matter how bad it gets, God can be with you.
Yeah.
Never trust your brother's execute plan.
Well, it was a good thing for Joseph that they didn't. But I think that this whole thing, we talked about this in Hebrews, that so many times when things are going really poorly, what do we assume? God isn't with us. And you really, I mean, this is probably the lowest point that Joseph's life is going to get to, is at the end of chapter 39. But what are we told? God is with him. Right? So, what do we need to remember, taking what we talked about in Hebrews? I was thinking about this. This was the perfect thing to go from Hebrews. Because what were we told in Hebrews about how God disciplines his children? Sometimes is it through trials and tribulations and difficult situations? Yes. And what we see here in Joseph is through these difficult situations, what is God doing with Joseph? Training him. He's disciplining him. He's training him. He's instructing him for a future that only God knows. Joseph doesn't know anything that's going to happen to him. As far as he knows, he will rot in this jail for the rest of his life. Okay? So, any thoughts as we close? I love the story of Joseph. It's an amazing story. So yeah. Okay, well, should we pray? Father,